September 1939, Bay Roberts Fishing Wharf, Newfoundland. Salt spray from the rough North Atlantic crashed against the aged wooden planks of the pier, while the slow, rhythmic clang of a lone bell buoy offshore was the only sound breaking the isolation. Newfoundland, still separate from Canada at the time, remained a distant British dominion, a land of scattered outports, relentless weather, and fog-drenched wilderness. The war had only just ignited in Europe, its thunder fell through distant artillery and marching armies, but here the tension arrived quietly, carried on the cold sea wind. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter was no fisherman. He was a highly trained German intelligence officer operating under the deep cover identity of a Swiss naturalist cataloging marine life. Standing near the water's edge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, he scanned the horizon not for seabirds but for the faint plume of smoke from an approaching Royal Navy vessel, or more importantly, the dark silhouette of a U-boat slipping in for a covert rendezvous. Richter was part of a small, widely dispersed Abwehr intelligence network operating throughout North America, tasked with monitoring Allied mobilization and, above all, identifying critical bottlenecks in the flow of American war material destined for Britain. Sabotage would come later, observation came first. And one observation point mattered above all others, wrapped in secrecy so deep it felt almost mythical: the Newfoundland airport. Known officially to only a handful of senior British and Canadian officials, the airfield had been constructed in the mid-1930s atop a swampy plateau near an abandoned railway stop called Gander. It was an immense and improbable undertaking, for enormous concrete runways carved from boreal forest, built for a future that had not yet arrived. That future was now war. Under Royal Canadian Air Force control, RCAF Station Gander was rapidly becoming the most strategically vital and closely guarded military installation in the Western Hemisphere. Richter's primary contact was an unassuming meteorologist near St. John's who intercepted and relayed encrypted radio transmissions. The decoded messages were filled with cryptic phrases: Hudson's cleared for departure, Liberators inbound, Beaver Brook Center prep complete. The words themselves meant little, but the volume of traffic-chilled German resolve. It was clear this was not merely a reconnaissance base, it was a throughput engine. Richter adjusted the fake spectacles on his nose and drew in a deep breath of salt air. He knew Gander existed, but its purpose was obscured behind layers of Allied deception and vast geographic distance. He had already dispatched 3 junior assets toward the Gander region, mostly local German sympathizers given basic training in radio signaling and aircraft counting. 2 never returned, likely lost to the brutal wilderness, or worse, intercepted by vigilant Canadian Army patrols guarding the perimeter. Then, in early November 1940, the first concrete and terrifying report arrived. Scribbled on thin paper and smuggled via fishing vessel to a neutral contact in Boston, then routed through South America back to Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, the report came from an elderly Newfoundlander known as the Coot, a railway worker near Gander Lake, unreliable, but persistent. He described an unnatural sight: 7 massive twin-engine bombers, later confirmed as Lockheed Hudsons, lined up on Gander's vast tarmac, not dismantled for shipment, but fully assembled, fueled, and crewed by an unusual mix of civilian and military pilots. They departed directly east, flying straight into the unforgiving North Atlantic winter. The implications struck Richter like a physical blow. They weren't shipping the aircraft, they were flying them. By bypassing U-boat-infested shipping lanes and eliminating weeks of vulnerability at sea, the Allies were delivering operational bombers directly to the beleaguered Royal Air Force. This was the birth of RAF Ferry Command, and Gander was its cradle. Richter understood the enormity of the logistical gamble. The North Atlantic route was lethal, riddled with storms, ice, and nearly impossible navigation. Hitler's planners had dismissed it as militarily absurd. Yet it was happening. If 7 aircraft could make it, how many would follow? Richter immediately compiled his most alarming intelligence summary, encoded so deeply it would take weeks to reach Berlin. The message was blunt: the American assembly line had circumvented the ocean. A new air bridge was operational. Newfoundland was the critical nexus. In Berlin, within the stark echoing halls of Abwehr headquarters, Colonel Ulrich Schmidt studied the translated reports filtering in from North America. Disturbed, he initially dismissed the November 1940 Hudson crossing as a desperate propaganda stunt. But subsequent intelligence from Richter's network suggested otherwise. Reports from Montreal detailed the furious, round-the-clock efforts of a vast multinational organization, RAF Ferry Command, headquartered there and aggressively recruiting civilian pilots, navigators, and radio operators from across the Commonwealth and even the still neutral United States. Their sole mission was to sustain this improbable aerial bridge. Schmidt leaned over a meticulously detailed Atlantic map. Traditional shipping lanes, marked with red lines in known U-boat patrol zones, told one story. The Great Circle Air route told another. By staging through Gander, flight distances were shortened enough for twin-engine bombers previously incapable of such crossings. Worse still was the scale of American industrial output. By mid-1941, the United States was transforming into the arsenal of democracy. Aircraft, B-24 Liberators, Hudsons, Bostons, and eventually P-51 Mustangs, were pouring off assembly lines in California and Texas. Intelligence confirmed they were flown across the continent to Canada, but it was Gander that remained the terrifying choke point. New reports described impossible levels of activity. Once a desolate swamp, Gander was becoming what Allied personnel now called the crossroads of the world. Squadron leader David McLean, a weathered Canadian pilot serving under Ferry Command, witnessed the chaos firsthand. Standing on the vast tarmac amid the smell of high-octane fuel, he saw runways that were never empty. Hudson bombers 1 hour, massive 4-engine Liberators the next. American construction crews worked alongside Canadian and Newfoundland civilians to expand hangars and infrastructure. Thousands of personnel, pilots, mechanics, meteorologists, radio specialists operated non-stop, all devoted to maintaining the flow. Weather teams exploited Gander's strategic location to provide minute-by-minute forecasts vital for launching aircraft into the deadly Atlantic maze. Meanwhile, Richter's newest asset, a civilian cook nicknamed the Spoon, risked his life counting aircraft movements simply by looking out mess hall windows. His final report, painstakingly transmitted, delivered the chilling truth to Schmidt's desk: the movement was not a trickle, it was a flood. 30, 40 aircraft a day. The runway was never idle. Production appeared endless. Schmidt now understood that viewing Gander as a vulnerable forward base was a fatal miscalculation. It wasn't a base, it was a machine, a transatlantic launch platform protected by distance, winter, and logistics beyond German reach. Unable to sink the planes at sea or strike the factories, Germany had no viable way to neutralize the funnel. As Schmidt briefed High Command during the bitter winter that followed, he illustrated the reality with a simple graph: U-boat sinkings versus aircraft deliveries. While convoys bled, bombers flew faster and safer. A Hudson that took weeks to ship could now cross the Atlantic in under 10 hours. The implication was devastating. For the first time, Schmidt grasped the strategic truth: the Battle of the Atlantic had been quietly undermined. The inexhaustible power of American industry had taken to the air, and Gander was the conduit pouring it directly onto Europe's battlefields. Gentlemen, Schmidt tapped the Gander section of his map and stated, "Our enemy is not only Great Britain. Our adversary is North American production. And this base, RCAF Station Gander, functions as the bypass valve." He meticulously detailed the staggering statistics gathered at immense risk by agents like Arthur and the Spoon. By the end of 1941, thousands of aircraft, including the first of the massive consolidated B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, had already passed through Gander and landed safely in Prestwick, Scotland. This continuous aerial pipeline meant that the British were receiving planes faster than the Luftwaffe could intercept them over the channel. The generals around the table grasped the implications for air superiority, but they struggled to comprehend the sheer scale of the North American industrial machine. "Surely the Atlantic weather will slow them in winter," one admiral challenged, referring to the infamous ferocity of winter gales that tore through the region. Schmidt conceded, "It slows them, yes, but it does not stop them." The Canadians and Americans have developed Gander into the world's most advanced meteorological station. Their weather crews, often young Newfoundland civilians intimately familiar with the North Atlantic, predict narrow windows of safe passage. They gamble and they win. Aircraft often departed Gander with only a few hours of margin, flying high above the storms that would have unsettled any U-boat captain. Schmidt's eyes swept the room. "The true calculation is this: we are fighting a war of attrition in the air, but the enemy's replacement rate is functionally limitless. Every 3 days, the Allies can replace the entire loss of the Battle of Britain simply through this air bridge. Our U-boat campaign is a tourniquet on an artery that is now being entirely bypassed. The ABV had explored sabotage, analyzing options such as parachuting agents near Gander Lake, infiltrating the sprawling temporary barracks, or even launching daring amphibious raids against the base's vulnerable fuel supplies. All options were deemed impossible. The perimeter was too vast, Canadian patrols too effective, and the lack of reliable cover in the subarctic spruce forest rendered any large-scale operation suicidal. The most devastating piece of intelligence came in the spring of 1942, as Ferry Command ramped up operations for the flying season. The report confirmed the delivery of the four-engine giants, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, strategic bombers capable of reaching the industrial heartlands of Germany. Klaus Richter, still operating in the shadows of Newfoundland, realized the moment he compiled the verified figures, Germany was not merely losing the Battle of the Atlantic, it was facing a future where its cities could be reduced to ash by bombers delivered weekly through this extraordinary Canadian air hub. The intelligence was blunt, unromantic, and devastatingly precise. The overwhelming volume of North American industrial output funneled through the Gander Air Bridge made German victory in the long term impossible. When Colonel Schmidt delivered his final assessment that the Allies had achieved a reliable, industrial-scale method of transferring strategic air power directly to Britain, effectively nullifying the U-boat war's impact on aircraft supply, the German High Command had no choice but to accept the cold calculus of defeat. The air war would now favor the Allies decisively, thanks to this secret base in the harsh Canadian wilderness. By 1943, RCAF Station Gander had grown into a staggering city unto itself. The years had passed, measured not in seasons but by the relentless mechanical roar of departing engines. It was now the largest airfield in the world by land area, with 4 colossal runways that rarely fell silent. What began with 7 small Hudson bombers had expanded into a torrent of metal, fuel, and manpower, solidifying Gander's nickname as the crossroads of the world. The Canadian military presence had reached its peak, integrating with American ground crews and thousands of Newfoundland civilians who kept the massive logistical machine operational. The RAF Ferry Command, later absorbed into the Royal Air Force Transport Command, had become a polished, high-volume operation. They weren't just flying B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, they ferried every type of aircraft the Allies required, from nimble P-51 Mustang fighters fitted with temporary ferry fuel tanks to multi-engine transports carrying critical personnel and high-value cargo. Pilot Officer Jean-Pierre Dubois, a young French-Canadian pilot flying a newly built B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, stood in the Gander briefing room. The energy was electric, a dizzying blend of adrenaline and exhaustion. Meteorological charts lined the walls, depicting the treacherous North Atlantic conditions, cumulonimbus thunderheads, icing zones, and shifting winds. Yet, the Ferry Command veterans had refined the transatlantic hop into a near-industrial science. Dubois listened intently as the weather officer detailed the high-altitude Blue Yonder route, designed to punch through the weather and avoid German U-boats, which had learned to monitor air traffic. "We have 32 aircraft departing in 3 waves over the next 6 hours, the officer instructed, including 6 Lockheed Ventras just before you. Maintain strict radio silence once you're off the coast." 32 aircraft in a single day, Gander was launching the equivalent of a small air force directly onto the doorstep of the collapsing German air defenses. For the German command, intelligence from the dwindling and increasingly isolated network in North America became a source of deep, demoralizing resignation. Colonel Schmidt, now in an administrative role after his accurate but politically inconvenient predictions, continued monitoring Ferry Command metrics. By the end of 1943, the total number of aircraft delivered through Gander would exceed 10,000. This staggering figure represented far more than metal and horsepower, it embodied the strategic doom he had foreseen. Hitler's fundamental miscalculation that the Western powers lacked the industrial will or logistical capacity to deploy their full economic might was laid bare. The Gander Airfield, built at the edge of the North American continent, had nullified the most devastating weapon of the U-boat war against Allied supply lines. It secured British air superiority, fueled the combined bomber offensive, and guaranteed the eventual Allied invasion of Europe. As Pilot Officer Dubois strapped into the cold metal seat of his B-25 Mitchell, the aircraft vibrating with raw power, he looked out over the endless tarmac. He saw not just runways and barracks, but a continuous ribbon of American production stretching back across the continent. His bomber, one among thousands, represented the inescapable reality that the German generals had to face: the war was already lost. The cockpit canopy closed, muffling the chaos of the ramp. With a final salute from the ground crew, Du Bois pushed the throttles forward. The Mitchell roared down the runway, lifted into the vast, frigid expanse of the North Atlantic, carrying its destructive payload and, more importantly, the inevitable truth of Allied victory across Europe. The Engine's thunderous roar was a final, irrefutable testament that the Third Reich could not prevail against an enemy whose industrial might had built an airborne bridge over the impossible Atlantic. Thank you for watching. If the incredible untold story of Gander and the impossible air bridge astonished you, please hit that subscribe button. This Canadian secret fundamentally altered the course of World War II. Which bomber or fighter do you think was most critical to the success of Ferry Command? Share your thoughts in the comments below.